the person who was at the front door. And he was standing there, and I don't think he was the main person. I think he was the guy outside who was waiting for them to come out.
He knew which door was unlocked. He knew where the flower pots were. He knew the layout of that back patio. He knew Nancy lived alone. He knew her schedule. He knew which lights would be on and which cameras had a blind spot. He knew what kind of woman Nancy Guthrie was, that she would not have expected this, that she had no reason to. He knew enough to come prepared, and he knew enough to come back. That is not the knowledge of a stranger. That is not what you learn from one drive-by of a neighborhood in the dark. You do not walk up to a house you have never approached before and already know exactly how the back gate swings open. You do not know which camera to avoid unless you have stood within its frame before and understood its angle. You do not know which door is going to give unless you have already studied the ones that won't. Think about what it takes to know a house like that. You have to have seen it in daylight and in darkness. You have to have walked the perimeter. You have to have stood at that back patio and looked at those two doors and made a mental note. That one. That is the one. You have to have had a reason to be there that nobody questioned at the time. A reason that made you invisible. A reason that made you normal. That is the question at the center of this investigation. Not just who took Nancy Guthrie, though that is the question that keeps her family awake every night. The question that has driven 60 days of federal investigation and a $1.2 million reward and canvassing and cadaver dogs and door-to-door interviews across the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona. Not just who, but how. How did he know this house the way he knew it? How did he know Nancy the way he clearly did? Not by name perhaps, but by pattern, by routine, by geography, by vulnerability. And today on day 60, there is finally a very clear answer to where investigators are looking. It is not a dramatic arrest. It is not a named suspect. It is something more precise than that. It is a lane, a direction, a specific corner of this investigation that the FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department are now running down with every resource they have. And if you follow the logic of that lane all the way to its conclusion, which is what we are going to do today, what you find waiting at the end of it is something that should make every person following this case stop and sit with the weight of it. The FBI may have already been face to face with the person who took Nancy Guthrie, and they may have let him walk. Before we examine exactly what investigators discovered on day 60 about who had access to Nancy Guthrie's property, and why the FBI is now running down every contractor, every subcontractor, everyday laborer who worked in that neighborhood, make sure you're subscribed to True Crime Vault and have notifications turned on. We bring you investigative analysis that follows where evidence actually leads rather than chasing headlines and speculation. Hit that subscribe button right now. Smash the like button to support coverage that examines real investigative processes and connects patterns across cases. Drop a comment telling us whether you think someone who worked on or near Nancy's property is responsible for her disappearance. Your engagement helps this reach people in the Tucson community who might have critical information about workers they saw in January. And if you know anything about contractors or workers in the Catalina foothills during January 2026, contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI. That number is 1-800-225-5324. The reward is $1.2 million. Now let's examine why day 60 changed everything about where this investigation is focused and what the Nancy Woodram case from 2018 tells us about what might happen next. The door, the pots, the gate. Let's start where this case starts, with what happened on the night of January 31st, 2026. Because the more closely you look at the physical evidence from that night, the more obvious it becomes that whoever came for Nancy Guthrie did not find his way in by accident. This was not an opportunistic crime. This was not someone who happened to be walking past and saw a door ajar. This was a prepared entry, a deliberate entry, an entry that required knowledge this person should not have had about a private home unless he had been there before. Savannah Guthrie herself confirmed it in her first sit-down interview since her mother's disappearance, a conversation with Hoda Kotb on the Today Show. Savannah said that the back doors to Nancy's home were found propped open, not forced, not shattered, not kicked in the way you see in a random break-in, propped deliberately. The back doors were propped open, you know, and that didn't make any sense. We thought maybe they came and there was a stretcher and they took her out the back. Someone had put something in the frame of those doors and left them standing open. And according to Ashley Banfield, who has been sourcing this case more aggressively and more consistently than any other journalist covering it, the method of propping was specific. Her sources in law enforcement told her that the suspect used Nancy's own flower pots to prop open 2 back patio doors and the back gate, all 3 held in place. The perpetrator used Nancy's flower pots to do this. He took her beautiful flower pots that I can only imagine she spent time nurturing and making beautiful for her back patio, and he used them for his evil plot. All of them ready for quick movement in and out of the property. Now stop and think about what that tells us. Propping open multiple access points is not a panicked decision. It is not improvised under pressure. When you prop open a door, it is because you have thought about what happens next. You need your hands free. You are moving something or someone. You are going to come back to that exit point, and you need to know it is going to be open when you do. And you know which doors to use because you already know the layout of this property. You have looked at those doors before. You have noted which ones align with the path to the gate. You have planned this route. According to Banfield's reporting based on multiple law enforcement sources, several security cameras and exterior lights at Nancy's home had also been disabled before or during the abduction. Think about what that requires. You have to know those cameras exist. Those spotlights dangling by the other back door that goes into the garage or to a storage room, maybe he took those lights out 2 weeks early knowing I'm coming this way. You have to know where they are mounted. You have to have an approach path to them that lets you take them out before they capture your face clearly. That means you have stood in the line of sight of those cameras before. You have seen them from the angle of a person standing in that yard. You have made a plan for them specifically. And then there is the detail that tells us the most about what kind of person we are dealing with. A masked figure wearing a backpack was captured on one of Nancy's security cameras at her doorstep before or during the abduction. The mask is important because the mask tells you 2 things simultaneously. First, he knew the cameras were still operational enough to capture his face if he showed it, so he came prepared for surveillance. Second, he masked his identity not because he was a stranger who feared being identified in a neighborhood he'd never visited, but because he had reason to believe that his face, without a mask, would mean something to someone. That his face recognized would connect dots that he needed to stay disconnected. Blood was found on Nancy's porch. That is confirmed. The presence of blood, the propped doors, the disabled cameras, the masked approach, all of it together tells a single story. This was not chaotic. This was organized. This was a person who had thought through every step of what would happen that night and had taken steps to control the outcome. And that level of preparation requires knowledge, specific physical on-site knowledge of that property. The kind of knowledge you only have if you have been there. So the question that has been underneath this investigation from the very beginning, before the first press conference, before Sheriff Nanos took a podium, before the reward money went up, is this. Who had legitimate access to Nancy Guthrie's home? Not who might have driven past it. Who had been inside it or around it or working near it in a way that nobody at the time found unusual or worth remembering? That is the question the FBI is now answering with the full weight of a federal investigation behind it. One of the most operationally telling pieces of reporting on this case so far comes from Brian Enton of News Nation. Enton has been on the ground in Tucson. He has been speaking with neighbors, and he has been one of the most disciplined and verified reporters on this case, not given to speculation, not chasing rumors. What he reported about the FBI's timeline of interest is significant. Investigators, according to Enton's sources, have been specifically asking neighbors about 2 dates, January 11th and January 24th. They've been interested in 2 specific dates, January 11th, which is something that I've reported before that I've heard from other neighbors, but also January 24th, which is the Saturday before Nancy Guthrie went missing, 8 days before. Both of those dates fall in the weeks before Nancy's disappearance on January 31st, and crucially, both of them fall on weekends. Now Enton was careful in how he framed this, and so are we. He said, paraphrasing, that he doesn't know for certain what the FBI has from those specific days. Looking at video from January 24th, they did not say exactly what they were looking for, but she said it was clear that it was January 24th and January 11th. But the theory he laid out, and it is a theory clearly attributed, not confirmed, is that the suspect may have been someone who worked during the week. someone who had a job, a regular schedule, a reason to be in a particular area on weekdays, but who used weekends to do something else. To move through a residential neighborhood without the cover of a work truck or a uniform. To look like a walker, a neighbor, someone who belonged on that street on a Saturday afternoon. Neighbor Laura Gargano, who has been in contact with both investigators and journalists, told Enton that FBI agents expressed specific interest in January 24th in their conversations with her. She also shared something from her own observations that she believes there may have been more than one person involved. The person who was at the front door, and he was standing there, and I don't think he was the main person. I think he was the guy outside who was waiting for them to come out. That someone may have already been inside the home while a second person waited at the porch. 2 people, 2 roles, a level of operational coordination that raises the complexity of what investigators are looking at even further. And neighbor Aldine Meister has also spoken about the FBI's intense canvassing of the neighborhood, agents going door to door asking about specific dates, asking about vehicles that seemed out of place, asking about workers people may have seen. Questions were pretty normal. They did ask me about January 11th, and that was about the time I saw the strange guy. So that all kind of connected with me. What was the date? Do you know the date you saw the strange guy? You know, it was around the 10th, 11th, or 12th. That level of canvassing conducted weeks into the investigation is not routine. That is a focused search. A search for a specific thread that was present on those 2 weekend days before January 31st. Think about what a 2-date pattern tells us. January 11th is 3 weeks before the abduction. January 24th is 7 days before. If the FBI is specifically asking neighbors about both of those Saturdays or Sundays, it is because they have something. A camera ping, a cell phone signal, a face captured in the corner of a Ring camera or a doorbell camera that places a person or a vehicle near Nancy's street on those specific days. This is not arbitrary. Investigators do not identify specific dates from weeks prior to a crime and canvass a neighborhood about them unless they have evidence that anchors those dates. Something happened on January 11th near that property. Something happened on January 24th near that property. And whatever happened, the FBI believes it was the same person who came back on January 31st. Think about what that means for the prior knowledge question. If this person was present near Nancy's property on January 11th and again on January 24th, he had a minimum of 2 opportunities to observe her routine, to watch which lights went off when, to understand when she was home and when the street went quiet, to look at those back patio doors and understand how they worked, to assess the angle of the cameras, to know that the flower pots on the patio were heavy enough to hold a door open, to stand at that back gate and understand exactly how it swung. 3 weeks of observation, 7 days of final planning, and then January 31st. So the question becomes, what was the context for his presence on those 2 weekend days? What gave him a reason to be on that street without raising any flags? And this is the question the FBI is spending every hour of the grind phase answering. Was that presence connected to work, to a job, to a specific task that put him near Nancy's home with the permission of a neighbor or a homeowner or a property management company or a contractor who hired him for a day? That is exactly what Day 60 answered. On Day 60 of the search for Nancy Guthrie, Wednesday, April 1st, 2026, Ashley Banfield published what may be the most operationally significant episode of Banfield that she has produced on this case. The episode confirmed through sources close to the investigation that the FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department are now running down every contractor, every subcontractor, and everyday laborer who had any access to Nancy Guthrie's property or to her surrounding neighborhood in the Catalina Foothills. Every single one. The scope of that is worth sitting with. Not just the licensed contractor who may have done permitted work on the home, not just the company with a business license and a truck. Every subcontractor that licensed company hired. Everyday laborer that subcontractor brought along for a week. Every person who showed up on a job site on a street near Nancy's home and unloaded equipment and worked within sight of her property and then packed up and drove away and was never asked for a name. Every one of them. A source close to the investigation described the process of tracking all of those people down with 2 words: a mess. And when you understand what that process actually involves, you understand why. Think about what it means to audit every person who performed any exterior or interior work in a residential neighborhood like the Catalina Foothills of Tucson, Arizona, over a window of several months leading up to January 31st, 2026. Think about the breadth of that. Pool maintenance companies, landscaping crews, painters, roofers, HVAC technicians coming to service units before the summer heat, plumbers, window washers, pest control operators, general handymen who get paid through apps or word of mouth, home renovation crews that break into 3-person teams and work separate rooms, electricians. Every one of those people had a legitimate reason to be near a property, a legitimate reason to be on that street, a legitimate reason that nobody questioned at the time. And then, there is the layer of complexity that Banfield's source flagged specifically, one that is unique to this geography and that adds significant difficulty to the investigation. This is Tucson. This is southern Arizona, a city that sits less than an hour's drive from the United States-Mexico border. The day labor market in this region is not a marketplace with clean paperwork and verified identifications and social security numbers attached to every name. Some of the workers who had access to properties in this neighborhood came to a job site because someone's cousin knew someone who needed help for 2 days. They were paid in cash. They may not have given a real name. There is no paycheck record, no tax form, no way to trace them through a database because they were never in any database. That is not a statement about immigration policy. That is a statement about the investigative reality of this geography and why Banfield's source used the word they did. It is a mess because the paper trail is not one trail. It is dozens of partial trails, and some of them do not lead anywhere at all. The Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed to Fox News Digital that law enforcement has been conducting door-to-door canvassing in Nancy's neighborhood, going from house to house, asking residents about the workers they have seen, the vehicles they remember, the jobs that were done on their properties in recent months. The FBI has also recovered footage from 3 cameras on Nancy's property. Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed that cadaver dogs have been put on pause. They remain available if needed, he said, and the nature of the ground search has shifted. This investigation has entered a different phase than what we were watching in the first few weeks. The task force itself has physically moved. Sergeant Aaron Cross, the president of the Pima County Deputies Organization, confirmed to Ashley Banfield that the Guthrie task force has been relocated into the FBI building in Tucson, a joint team. The task force, once it was created, now that they've been moved out of our building into the FBI building in Tucson, it's made information even more secure than it already was. And they did a pretty good job even before they moved. Federal agents and sheriff's detectives working under the same roof in a federal facility. That is a structural signal about where the center of gravity of this investigation has shifted. This is not the PCSD running leads while the FBI watches. This is a fully integrated federal operation, and the FBI has the resources, the technology, and the interagency relationships to run down contractor networks in ways that a county sheriff's department simply cannot do. Sergeant Cross spoke with Banfield about what phase the investigation is in, and he was direct. The grind phase, in his words. And I am paraphrasing. Some cases break quickly because most people who commit crimes are not particularly sophisticated. This one appeared to be different. This one appeared to involve preparation. So from the beginning, it was never going to break quickly. That does not mean it has stalled. That means investigators are doing exactly what you do when a case is hard and the suspect is careful. You build the net slowly and you make it tighter every week until there is nowhere left to go. Subscribe to True Crime Vault and turn on all notifications for updates as this investigation develops. Like this video to support coverage that examines real investigative methodology rather than speculation. Share this video with people in the Tucson community because someone might remember seeing workers in the Catalina Foothills during January. Someone might know a contractor who had access to that neighborhood. Comment with your thoughts on whether the FBI has already interviewed the person responsible without knowing it yet. Visit our channel for comprehensive coverage of Nancy's case. And if you worked in construction or landscaping or any service capacity in the Catalina Foothills during January 2026 and saw anything unusual, or if you know someone whose behavior changed around February 1st, contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or Pima County Sheriff at 520-351-4900. $1.2 million in reward money is waiting. The Guthrie family has not gone quiet. They issued a public statement on March 21st, the 50th day of Nancy's disappearance, asking the community for renewed attention. Their words were specific. No detail is too small. It may be the key, not a general plea. A targeted request aimed at people who may have seen something in January near that neighborhood, near those specific weekend dates, and not realized at the time that what they saw mattered. The family's reward is $1 million. When combined with FBI and Crime Stoppers contributions, the total reward pool sits at approximately $1.2 million. That is a number that has a real effect on people who may be sitting on information. That is a number that for a day laborer who worked near that neighborhood and may have seen something or heard something or know someone who was bragging about something, that is a life-changing number. And investigators are counting on that math to work on someone at some point. Savannah Guthrie, speaking publicly for the first time since her mother's disappearance in her Today Show interview, described her family as still blowing on the embers of hope. Those are not the words of a family that has given up. Those are the words of a family that is waiting for the moment when investigation catches up to the person who did this. Now let's talk about another Nancy. There is another woman named Nancy who vanished from her own home, who lived alone, who was loved by her community, who disappeared under circumstances that bore no obvious explanation in the early days of the investigation, whose case ultimately broke on the back of a contractor who had legitimate access to her property, a person who had already been in contact with investigators before anyone knew he was responsible. Her name was Nancy Woodram. She was 62 years old. She lived in Paso Robles, California, in a Victorian ranch home she had named Paradise Ranch, a name that reflected the kind of woman she was. She ran a hair salon in town. She was a grandmother. She was a devout Jehovah's Witness. She was, by every account from the people who knew her, the kind of person who made everyone in her orbit feel more seen and more cared for. On the night of May 5, 2018, Cinco de Mayo, she vanished from her own bedroom. There was blood at the scene, a mixture of two DNAs, Nancy Woodram's and an unidentified male. The combination of those two samples created a technical problem for investigators that would stall the case for months because combined DNA, a mixture of two people's genetic material, rather than a single clean profile, cannot be entered into CODIS, the national criminal database that law enforcement uses to match DNA samples against known offenders. So investigators had a male contributor's DNA. They had evidence. They had a partial biological fingerprint of whoever had been in that bedroom, and they could not use any of it to find him through the standard channels. What they could do was start working through the people who had been near Nancy Woodram's property in the period before her death. And in Woodram's case, one of the key categories of people who had been near her property was workers, contractors, people she had hired to do work on her home. Paradise Ranch was a large property, and Woodram was preparing it for sale. That meant she had workers coming and going in the weeks before her disappearance. Multiple contractors, multiple crews, multiple people with legitimate access to the property, to the house, to the outbuildings, to the terrain. One of those workers was a man named Carlo Alberto Fuentes Flores. He was a painter. He had been hired to paint the deck at Paradise Ranch in the weeks leading up to Woodram's disappearance. He had been on the property. He knew the layout. He had worked on it with his own hands. He had moved around that property in a way that gave him an understanding of it that went beyond what you get from standing on the street and looking at the fence. In the early weeks of the investigation, the lead detective on the case, Clint Cole of the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office, reached out to Fuentes Flores, not as a suspect, as a peripheral contact. Someone who had been around the property and might have seen or heard something. Cole made that contact by phone. Fuentes Flores answered. He gave his responses. He was cooperative in the way that people are cooperative when they believe they are not the subject of the inquiry. And then the conversation ended and Fuentes Flores went on with his life. The investigation continued without him at the center of it. Other leads were pursued. Other possible persons of interest came and went. The case, in the words used to describe the Guthrie case today, entered the grind phase. Months passed. The blood DNA sat without a match. And then the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office did something that had barely been done before in a criminal case in California. They deployed a Google geofence warrant. A geofence warrant asks Google to identify which cell phone devices tied to Google accounts, to Android phones, to the vast digital ecosystem that Google maintains, were present within a defined geographic perimeter during a specific time window. Investigators drew that perimeter around Paradise Ranch and asked Google to tell them which devices had been inside that boundary on the night Nancy Woodram disappeared. And the data came back with 2 devices pinging inside her studio at 1:15 and 1:30 in the morning. One of those devices traced back to Carlo Fuentes Flores, the painter, the man who had already been contacted by investigators as a peripheral figure, the man who had answered Cole's phone call, given his responses, and been allowed to move on. The same man, months later, placed by cell phone data inside the home of a victim at the hour of her death. Investigators then collected his DNA covertly. They followed him to a restaurant and retrieved a Coke bottle he had handled. They compared that DNA to the male profile extracted from the mixture sample found at Nancy Woodram's bedroom. It matched. They arrested Fuentes Flores in December of 2018, 7 months after Nancy Woodram's disappearance. In the interview room under questioning, he eventually led investigators to her remains in a remote area off Highway 58, in a rural and isolated part of eastern San Luis Obispo County. He confessed. He was tried. He was convicted of first-degree murder during the commission of a felony. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He is currently incarcerated. Justice came for Nancy Woodram, but it took 7 months. It required technology that was almost entirely new to criminal investigation at the time, and it required circling back to a man who had already been in the peripheral vision of the investigation from its early weeks. A man who had already answered questions, already been noted, already been allowed to walk, and connecting that man to the evidence that had been sitting in a lab database the whole time. The detective who led that investigation is a retired San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's detective named Clint Cole. You may know his name from the Kristen Smart case, the 1996 disappearance of a Cal Poly student that went unsolved for more than 26 years before Cole's persistent work and the use of investigative genetic genealogy helped crack it. Cole is not someone who gives interviews for attention. He is not a pundit. He is a detective's detective, someone who talks about cases because the cases still matter, because justice for the people who were taken still matters, and because there are things a veteran investigator understands about how these cases actually work that are worth putting on the record. When Ashley Banfield brought Cole onto her show on day 60 specifically to discuss the Nancy Guthrie investigation, it was not by accident. The parallels between the 2 cases, the 2 Nancys, both living alone, both on large properties, both taken in the night, both leaving behind a crime scene that pointed to someone who had been there before, are not lost on anyone who has followed both. In our case, we had quite a few contractors on scene. In the case in our Nancy Woodram case, the house had been sold, and Cole has now become one of the most credible external voices connecting what happened in Paso Robles in 2018 to what investigators are pursuing in Tucson in 2026. Here is what Cole understands about contractor-heavy investigations that most people who follow true crime cases do not. When you are investigating a case where the suspect pool is primarily composed of people who had legitimate access to the victim's property, workers, contractors, hired hands, the fundamental challenge is not identifying them. You can identify them. You can pull permit records. You can knock on doors. You can ask the homeowner's neighbors who they saw working on which properties and which months. The challenge is the scope, because legitimate access is almost always a large pool, and you have to eliminate every person in that pool before you can apply the kind of targeted technology, geofencing, covert DNA collection, surveillance, that actually closes a case. Cole reflected on something from the Woodram investigation in a post-retirement interview with the Paso Robles Press. His first contact with Carlo Fuentes Flores was a phone call. He reached out to the painter in the early weeks of the investigation, not because Fuentes Flores was a suspect, but because he had been on the property and investigators were talking to everyone who had been on the property. Fuentes Flores was on the list of workers. Cole called him. Fuentes Flores answered and spoke with him, and that was the end of that particular thread for months, until the geofence data rewrote the entire story. What Cole said afterward about that early phone call has stayed with investigators and journalists who have followed his career. He said, "I learned a lesson in an important case. Talk to them in person. Because a phone call gives you words, It gives you answers. It gives you responses crafted by someone who knows how to give responses. But an in-person conversation, sitting across from someone in a room, watching them breathe, watching them find the answer, watching the interval between your question and their reply, that gives you a person. And sometimes a person under the kind of pressure that a face-to-face law enforcement interview creates will give you something that no phone call ever would. A micro-expression, a pause that runs half a second too long, eyes that go somewhere before the words arrive. Cole knew what that looked like. He just did not get the chance to see it early enough. That lesson, talk to them in person, is now being applied in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona. The agents going door to door in Nancy's neighborhood are not emailing former contractors. They are showing up, knocking, sitting down across from people in their kitchens or their driveways, looking them in the eye and asking where they were working in January and whether they have any record of time spent near that street. And according to the sourcing from Banfield's Day 60 episode, Cole shared with her the conclusion that his Woodram experience leads him to. That in a case like this, where investigators are running down everyone who may have had access to the property, there is a strong likelihood that they have already spoken to the right person. They may already have a name on a page. They may already have sat across from the person who took Nancy Guthrie as part of a broad canvas, as one of dozens of workers being interviewed, and may not yet have connected all the threads that moved that name from peripheral to central. That is the Woodram lesson. That is what Cole is telling anyone who is paying attention. The detective who eventually arrested a killer had already spoken to that killer. He had called him on the phone and heard his voice and let him go. The geofence is what brought him back. The technology is what closed the gap between a name on a list and a person in handcuffs. And that is the exact same technology and the exact same investigative logic that is now being deployed in Tucson by a joint FBI and PCSD task force operating out of a federal building. So let's talk about where this leaves us right now, Day 60. Before we get to what Clint Cole's experience tells us about this specific moment in the investigation, I want to make something absolutely clear about what this analysis is and is not. Everything we have discussed today is grounded in verified reporting, Banfield sourcing, Brian Entin sourcing, the confirmed facts from the PCSD and the FBI as reported through mainstream press. But the conclusion we are about to arrive at is analytical. It is a possibility. It is the possibility that emerges when you lay the Woodram blueprint on top of the Guthrie case and follow the logic where it leads. We are not saying the FBI has identified a contractor. We are not saying a contractor has been caught. We are not saying anyone is guilty of anything. We are saying here is what the evidence of Day 60 tells us about where this investigation is, what phase it is in, and what that means for what may already have happened in the interview rooms and on the doorsteps of Tucson. The FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department are running down every contractor, every subcontractor, every day laborer who had any access to Nancy Guthrie's home or her neighborhood. They are doing it door to door. They are doing it with federal resources. They are doing it in the grind phase of a joint task force that is relocated into a federal facility. And the process, according to a source with direct knowledge, is a mess. Not because investigators are failing, but because the scope of who had legitimate access to that neighborhood is genuinely large and genuinely complex. And here is what Clint Cole's experience in Paso Robles tells us about what that means right now in Tucson, in the interviews that are already being conducted. Somewhere in that pool of workers, somewhere in the names that have already been written in an investigator's notebook, the faces that have already been seen across a kitchen table or a front porch, the people who have already been asked, were you working anywhere near this street in January? Do you have any records of that? Would you be willing to let us see your phone? Somewhere in all of that, there may be a face that the FBI has already seen and did not yet know what it meant. The FBI may have already sat across from the person who took Nancy Guthrie. They may have already heard his answers. They may have already written his name on a list of workers interviewed and drawn a line through it, checked, accounted for, moved on. And if the Woodram case is the blueprint, and every expert who has appeared on Banfield's show in the week since she first drew that parallel believes it is, then what comes next is not finding this person for the first time. What comes next is finding the digital thread that moves him from the checked column to the center of the page. The geofence data, the cell phone ping, the financial record that shows a cash payment from a homeowner on a street near Nancy's address in the third week of January. The digital crumb that was sitting in a server somewhere from the moment he walked into range of that perimeter, waiting for investigators to ask the right question of the right database. That is what the grind phase is for. That is what Sergeant Aaron Cross meant when he said this case was never going to break quickly. That is what Banfield's source meant when they said it is a mess. Because the mess is not disorder, the mess is the work. The painstaking, methodical, exhausting work of eliminating every person who had a legitimate reason to be near that property until you are left with the one person whose reason was not what he said it was. He knew which door was unlocked. He knew where the flower pots were. He knew the layout of that back patio. He knew Nancy lived alone. He knew her schedule. That knowledge came from somewhere. From some visit, some job, some morning standing in view of that house with a reason to be there that nobody at the time thought to question. A reason that put him on that street on a January weekend twice before he came back with a mask and a backpack on the last night of January and used everything he knew. The FBI knows it too. They are working their way toward the person who knew it. And if the pattern holds, if the lesson of Paso Robles applies to Tucson the way every expert who has studied both cases believes it does, the name of that person may already be somewhere in the investigation, already written, already noted, just waiting for the technology to close the distance. If you have any information about the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, please call the FBI tip line at 1-800-CALL-FBI. That number is 1-800-225-5324. Or contact Crime Stoppers. The Guthrie family is offering $1 million for information leading to Nancy's safe return. The total reward pool, including FBI and Crime Stoppers contributions, is approximately $1.2 million. Every detail matters. Every memory from January matters. If you saw a vehicle, a worker, an unfamiliar face near that neighborhood in January of this year, please make that call. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She had lived in that community for decades. She had dinner with her family on a Saturday evening, played card games, laughed, and trusted the world around her completely. She deserved to go home safely that night. She deserved safety and dignity and the protection of the community she'd been part of for so long. And somebody knows what happened. Somebody who may have worked on or near her property. Somebody who knew that house in a way that only comes from being there. Somebody whose name might already be in an FBI notebook waiting for technology to connect the dots. The contractor angle is not speculation. It is where the investigation is focused right now, day 60. And if Nancy Woodram's case teaches us anything, it is that justice can come even when the suspect walked away the first time investigators spoke to him. Because eventually, the digital evidence catches up. Eventually, the geofence closes. Eventually, there is nowhere left to hide.